This story is about an event that happened to my mother around 1972 when she was 8 years old. She's told me about it since I was young, and she still thinks about it and is affected to this day. To set the scene, both of my grandparents ran a restaurant gas station in our hometown. They have always ran a business of some type since the 50s. This means that a lot of days my mom would have to take the bus home and stay by herself if my grandma had to stay and help run things. Usually no more than an hour or two. My uncle, her older brother, would usually come home on the bus with her, but he was a little older and sometimes had football practice. And so this was the case on the day of the event I'm getting to. So my mother arrived home on this day, let herself in the house and put away her things. She had just recently received a new puppy and knew the first thing she had to do was to take the puppy out to the yard to use the restroom. She wrapped the dog in a white towel, this is important, and walked him outside. As she put down the dog, she shook its hair out of the blanket, flailing it about in the wind. It's then she noticed the neighbor's son was staring at her from across the street. This guy was in his late 20s, was known to be very strange and mentally ill. Though, in the country, mental illness seems not to always be recognized. He would do psycho stuff, like killing the neighbor's pigs or skinning stray cats and hanging them from a clothesline in their yard. Real sick stuff. My mom said he always creeped her and everyone else out. She said he would stare at her when she would play outside and made her feel generally uncomfortable. She said he appeared out of nowhere in his yard that day, and as she shook the blanket out, he began grinning and waving. Feeling more than a little shook, she picked up her pup, went inside and locked the door. She began to do some homework, and after about 5 minutes of work, she heard a loud knock at the door. She slowly walked to the window to see who it was. She knew it was my grandparents because of course they had keys. As she opened the blinds, her eyes locked with those of the creep from across the street, like he was already looking in the window. She jumped and said she screamed a little as she shut the blinds. She walked to the door and made sure it was locked. She said he just continued with a slow continuous thud on the door, almost in a rhythm. Then, she really got terrified as he began speaking to her through the door. "Hi sweetie, I saw you with your doggy, let me in to see him." She was in shock. In full freak out mode, my mom screamed and demanded that the man would leave. He kept knocking, with this constant, eerie rhythm. I can see the fear in my mom's eyes when she describes that part, and it gives my whole body chills. The man got impatient and screamed at my mom again. "Damn it, let me in. I saw you waving your flag of surrender." I kid you not. The guy thought my mom shaking hair from the blanket was a flag of surrender and a sign for him to come over. My mom screamed that she would call her dad and the police if he didn't leave now. With this, the knocking stopped. She tried to catch her breath and shake off her fear. She then got up from the door and ran to the basement level of the home. It was an old house, so the kitchen and rec room was down there along with the only phone in the house. She made it to the phone and began to dial 911. All of a sudden, she heard a shatter from the next room. She looked over to see the crazed neighbor attempting to crawl through the kitchen window. He was ripping down the curtain as his upper body got through, and my mother screamed what was happening to the police on the phone. All of a sudden, he started bleeding from the abdomen where the window glass had cut him as his lower half couldn't squeeze through. Then, my mom began hearing my grandmother's screams. Then the guy yelling in pain and squirming out the window as she hit him from behind with some tool that was laying in their garden. The bastard managed to get out of the window and bolted to his house. The police came. Grandma called my grandfather and he arrived as well after shutting down the business as soon as possible. They arrested him for breaking and entering and something else I believe that was unrelated. Probation violation I assume. On the day of his court date, he told him about the white flag of surrender story. This was the final nut on his crazy cake as they put him in mental institution that day. He may have gotten out, but went back because my mother said he later died in an institution. Outside of the courthouse, the crazy redneck family of the creep tried to blame my 8-year-old mother, and the man's father called my mother a harlot. Needless to say, my army-trained grandpa beat the guy's ass on the courthouse steps, as local police turned a blind eye. That story has always stuck with me. My mom had to receive therapy for it, so it haunts her a lot, to this day. We always can't help but wonder though, what would he have done to her if my grandma didn't come home at that moment? I live on a dead end, quiet street that has 6 houses, 3 on each side. The house that faces mine is the only rental on the street, and the other homes have all been owned by the same owners for 10 plus years, including ours. The previous renters had serious drug, alcohol, and domestic issues, and the police were there constantly, so when Jeff and his family, wife, a son of 5, and a daughter of 2 moved in, the entire neighborhood was relieved to have normal neighbors again. At the time, my husband was going to school and I worked all different hours, so my schedule wasn't set by any means. I would come home late, leave early, etc. Our house has a huge window, 12 by 10, that is to the left of our front door and looks into our front room, which we rarely use. It has 2 chairs, a fireplace, just a filler space. If you look in that window, you can see past the front room and partially into the kitchen. That window lines up perfectly with the driveway of the rental house across the street. So, Jeff came over and introduced himself and said he was a stay-at-home dad. He looked like the dorky dad in any sitcom. The first thing we noticed was that he was always outside. Rain, snow, sun, it didn't matter. He was outside. He always wore a red hoodie zipped up, hood up, and would always be outside front. No big deal, just weird. His kids were rarely outside. His wife left every morning at 5 a.m. and returned after dark. Then, he started mowing his lawn. He would bring his son to school, come home, and mow the lawn. Pick his son up from school in the afternoon, mow his lawn. Then he started with the hose. He would wash off his driveway for hours. My husband counted 7 hours on one Sunday. We figured maybe it was stress relieving for him or something. Then, he started the staring. He would stand at the end of his driveway, feet at the edge of the street, and stare into our window. I would be cooking dinner, catch a glimpse of his red, and there he was, staring. He would do this all the time, all hours of the day and night. Sometimes he would mix the two, and stare into our window while spraying the road with his hose. We looked into purchasing blinds for that huge window, but it would set us back about $700, so we just hoped he would stop eventually. Summer hit, and my kids would ride their bikes outside, and I would lay on the blanket in front, reading. Jeff came over with his 2-year-old, Lily, and said, "She wants to play in the park." I told him no, that we were going inside, and he said, "That's okay." He stayed in our yards for 2 hours after we went inside, and after that, would always be in our yard whether we were home or not. Eventually, I wouldn't let my kids out front because of him. There was no telling him to get off our property. He would just say no. It seemed extreme to call the police for trespassing, so I just locked us inside. Then, we started getting mail addressed to him at our address. Things like magazine, etc. My husband just shrugged it off as some typo, but there was a lot of stuff. At first, I'd have my kids run it over to their mailbox, but after a few months, I started throwing it away. 10:30 on one night, Jeff knocks on my door, and I answer, and he asks if I have his mail. I said no. Then he winks and asks me if I have 2 eggs, you know. No, I don't. He leaves and resumes his spot, staring in my window. Then, he started waiting for me to come home. I would pull into my driveway at 2 a.m. and open my door, and there he is, standing a foot away. I would come home at 11 p.m., and there he would be, and would comment about my strange hours, etc. I left for work one morning at 6 a.m., and he was standing in his driveway, staring at me. I feel he was watching at my house constantly. This was constant, over the course of a year, non-stop. The staring, the hose, the waiting by my car, the sitting in my yard. Finally, one night, I was cooking dinner and glanced out the window, and he's standing perfectly still in the center of the road, staring inside. I go and stand at the window, make eye contact for what feels like forever. He doesn't move, doesn't smile, nothing. What the hell? When my husband came home that night, I tell him I don't care how much the blinds cost. We are covering that window because I'm tired of being watched 24/7. I was ready to hang a blanket for God's sake. So we go to Home Depot and purchase these blinds, come around the corner, and there's Jeff. He followed us to Home Depot. My husband installed the blinds that night, and that weekend in the night, Jeff and his family moved out. One day they were there, the next day they were gone. Just like that. So weird. If I had known purchasing the blinds would be what made them leave, I would have done it earlier. Unfortunately, this is not where the story ends. For the next 2 months, if my husband, never me, went to Costco, the grocery store or something, Jeff was always there. He would just nod at my husband and never say anything, but always be where my husband was. I have a feeling he was waiting at the entrance of our road to follow him. Then, it just stopped. It's been 6 months since, to this day, and I hope we will never have to face Jeff ever again. My family and I used to live in a rough neighborhood when I was a 7-year-old kid. One night, it was just my mom, me, and my 2 siblings at home, and my dad was gone on a business trip. Around midnight, someone started knocking on our door. My mom woke up and went to the front door and asked who it was. No one answered. She thought that maybe it was some kids playing ding-dong ditch, so she went back to bed. About 30 minutes later, again, someone starts knocking. She gets up and peers through the side window to see if she can spot anyone out there, but nobody's there. She starts to worry, so she gets back to the room and grabs my dad's shotgun and sits in the living room in the dark, waiting. Again, there's knocking. My mom begins shouting at whoever it is that she's going to call the cops and that if anyone tries to come in, she would shoot them. At about 2 a.m., the police finally show up and do a quick search outside of our house while we waited inside. After their search, they tell my mom that they had found a piece of barbed wire about 4 feet long next to the front door and asked if it belonged to my mom. She said that it wasn't hers and asked why. The cop told her it belonged to whoever was knocking on the door and that they were planning on strangling my mom with the barbed wire when she opened the door to see who was knocking. They said she was very smart not to open the door to see who was there. Otherwise, it could have costed her life. The cops said that they'd patrol the neighborhood until morning and do a thorough investigation once there was daylight. That morning, as they were searching around the house, they found footprints leading around to the back of the house, leading up to my bedroom window. They'd also found nicks in the window sill, where the person was trying to pry open the window, trying to break in, but it failed. My mom always suspected it was this one neighbor because he would always stare at my mom through his curtains and wasn't very friendly. He also knew when my dad wasn't home, since he knows what vehicle he drives. Shortly after, we moved out of that house. This happened in 2008, when I was 9 years old. I lived in a townhome community, where each road had 2 sides of homes. In between the backs of the houses, there was a back road with alleyways that went in between each building section. I lived on the edge of one of these, and my townhome was on one of the alleyways. I lived on one street, and across the back road on the opposite side lived an elderly woman whose name I don't even know. I am not sure what her situation was, but for whatever reason, she never liked me specifically. She was creepy, and spray painted all of her windows so no one could see in her house. However, that never stopped her from sometimes staring out her bedroom window directly at mine, and keeping it open at night to shine a red strobe light into my room across the way. She used to yell how she hated us. I was in 4th grade, and on one particular January morning, I had unfortunately missed the bus. My dad sent me outside to get in the car so he could drive me, and he said that he'd follow me out soon after. As I was walking to my dad's car, she came out of the alleyway next to my house, slowly, with a gigantic kitchen knife behind her back. She raised it and started running after me. I was faster than her, so I was able to avoid her and was able to get into the house again. She walked and stood on the neighbor's porch across the way and stared at my house. I was terrified. My dad ran out and yelled at her, and she said she wanted to get rid of us stupid kids. My parents called the police, but the police sent her home and had an ambulance pick her up later. My parents went to some kind of court meeting about it, but I don't really know the details. I didn't see her again after that, until 1 year later. I don't remember the day, but it had snowed that morning, so I was going to run out the front door and play in the snow. I opened the door to see her standing on her porch, but looking out towards the road. I panicked, closed and locked the door. I ran to my parents' room and told them what happened, and we saw her walk off the porch up the street. I never saw her again after that.